On the night of October 4th, 1957, the world changed. Not with an explosion, not with a speech, not with an army crossing a border. It changed with a beep. High above the Earth, a small polished sphere circled the planet, invisible to most of the people below it. It carried no crew, no camera, no flag, no grand message carved into metal for future generations. Just a radio transmitter, 4 long antennas, and a steady signal echoing down through the darkness. Beep, 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 simple, mechanical, unemotional, and absolutely terrifying, because that sound meant something humanity had never heard before. It meant that an object built by human hands was now in orbit around the Earth. It meant the sky was no longer out of reach. It meant the Soviet Union had done something first, and the rest of the world was now forced to catch up. In the United States, that signal landed like a shockwave. Newspapers splashed the story across their front pages. Politicians scrambled for answers. Military officials worried about what it meant. Teachers, scientists, and ordinary families all looked up at the night sky a little differently. Because if the Soviets could put a satellite over your head, what else could they put there? Sputnik was small. It was simple. It was little more than a metal ball with a radio. But in that moment, it became something much larger. A symbol, a warning, a starting gun. The future had arrived, and it was orbiting overhead. This was not yet the age of moon landings, space shuttles, or space stations. No astronauts had flown beyond the atmosphere. No footprints marked the lunar surface. No one had yet seen the Earth from orbit with their own eyes. But the path to all of that began here, with a silver sphere, a radio signal, and a world suddenly realizing that space was no longer science fiction. It was real. This is Orbital Briefing, and this week we begin at the beginning, Sputnik, the beginning of the space age.
Welcome to Orbital Briefing, the podcast where we explore the missions, the people, and the science that built humanity's journey into space. From Mercury to Artemis, we dive deep into the stories behind the rockets that carried us beyond Earth. This is Orbital Briefing.
This episode is brought to you by Retrojet Studios. If you're into spaceflight, NASA history, and clean, mission-inspired design, you can explore posters, collectibles, and more at retrojetstudios.com.
In this part of the episode, we set the stage. Because Sputnik did not appear out of nowhere. To understand why that tiny satellite shook the world so deeply, we have to understand the moment in history it entered. By the time Sputnik launched in October of 1957, the world was already living under a shadow. The Second World War had ended just over a decade earlier, but peace had not brought comfort. Instead, it gave way to a new kind of tension. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the war as powerful rivals, and by the 1950s they were locked in what became known as the Cold War. It was a struggle without direct full-scale war between the two superpowers, but it was no less intense. It played out through espionage, weapons development, propaganda, proxy conflicts, political pressure, and a relentless competition for global influence. Each side wanted to prove that its system was stronger. Each side wanted to prove that its people were smarter. Each side wanted to prove that the future belonged to them. In that kind of rivalry, technology became more than technology. A new airplane was not just an airplane. A nuclear weapon was not just a weapon. A rocket was not just a rocket. Every major breakthrough became a political statement. That is what made the 1950s such a dangerous and fascinating time. Beneath the public language of science and progress was a much deeper reality. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were racing to master long-range rockets. The same technology that could lift a scientific instrument high above Earth could also carry a warhead across continents. That fact sat at the center of everything. To the public, rockets still felt futuristic. They belonged to comic strips, movie serials, and science fiction magazines. But to military planners and political leaders, rockets were becoming the next frontier of power. The nation that mastered them first would gain an enormous advantage in prestige, strategy, and fear. And fear mattered, because fear shapes policy, fear shapes spending, fear shapes public imagination. The Cold War was built on the idea that you could not afford to fall behind. At the same time, the scientific community had its own ambitions. The late 1950s were marked by the International Geophysical Year, a global scientific effort that ran from 1957 into 1958. Researchers from many countries were collaborating on large-scale studies of the Earth and its environment, from the upper atmosphere to the poles to the oceans. It was a rare moment when science was presented as an international endeavor, even in a divided world. Launching satellites became part of that vision. Scientists understood that a satellite could do something extraordinary. It could orbit above the Earth and gather information that no ground-based instrument could fully capture. It could help humanity begin to study the planet from above, opening a completely new way of looking at weather, atmosphere, radio propagation, and the shape of the Earth itself. So on the surface, the idea of launching a satellite sounded peaceful, scientific, cooperative, almost idealistic. But no one was naive. Everyone understood that being first mattered. Everyone understood that the nation capable of putting a satellite into orbit was also demonstrating something far bigger than scientific curiosity. It was demonstrating the power of its rockets. And so the race was on. Both the United States and the Soviet Union announced plans to launch satellites during the International Geophysical Year. The United States expected to be a major contender. America had vast industrial capacity, major universities, talented engineers, and enormous resources. Many Americans assumed that if a satellite were going to be launched, the United States would do it first. But the Soviet Union had been moving aggressively and often in greater secrecy. That secrecy mattered too. In the United States, much of scientific and military development existed in a system where public announcements, political debates, and media coverage were part of the process. In the Soviet Union, major programs could unfold behind closed doors, with fewer public clues and fewer outside expectations. That meant that when the Soviets succeeded, the shock would be even greater. And in 1957, shock was exactly what was coming. It is also important to remember how different the world felt then. Today, we live with satellites so completely that most people barely think about them. Satellites guide our phones, power our maps, deliver television, support communications, monitor weather, enable banking systems, and help militaries operate around the globe. But in 1957, none of that existed. There were no satellite weather forecasts in ordinary homes, no GPS, no live global satellite television, no routine launches every week. Space was not yet a domain of normal human activity. It was still mostly imagination. When Sputnik launched, it was not entering a crowded sky. It was entering an empty one. There were no other artificial satellites circling Earth, no space stations, no history of orbital missions, nothing. That gave the launch a kind of purity and shock that is hard to recreate today. The first object in orbit was not merely another machine added to a growing network. It was the moment the entire concept became real. For generations, people had looked at the stars and imagined going there. Writers imagined journeys to the moon. Scientists dreamed about rockets. Engineers sketched concepts that seemed bold and distant. But now one of those dreams was no longer on paper. It was moving overhead. And because it was the Soviet Union that got there first, the meaning of that moment instantly became political. In the American imagination, Sputnik was not just a scientific object. It was a challenge. It suggested that the Soviets were ahead in a field that many Americans assumed their own nation would dominate. It raised uncomfortable questions. If the Soviet Union had the rocket power to launch a satellite into orbit, did that mean it also had the ability to strike across the globe? If they could do this in public, what else were they capable of in secret? Had the United States been too slow, too complacent, too confident? These were not abstract concerns. They were felt in homes, classrooms, laboratories, and the halls of government. Suddenly, science education became a national issue. Rocket development became a cultural obsession. Space became a strategic theater. The launch of a single satellite put pressure on political leaders to respond, on scientists to accelerate, on the military to think differently, and on ordinary people to rethink where the future was heading. That is why Sputnik mattered so much. It mattered because it crossed a threshold. Before Sputnik, spaceflight was mostly potential. After Sputnik, it was real. And once it became real, everything changed. The launch forced governments to recognize that space was not some distant fantasy to be dealt with later. It was immediate. It was strategic, it was technological, it was psychological, and it was now. That is the world Sputnik entered on October 4th, 1957. A world already tense, a world already divided, a world already looking for signs of who would lead the future. And then, from the Soviet Union, came an answer, not in the form of a speech, not in the form of a parade, but in the form of a small silver satellite circling above the Earth, telling everyone below that the space age had begun. In this part of the episode, we tell the story of Sputnik itself. This is the section where the abstract idea becomes a real event. A launch pad, a rocket, a satellite, a signal, a world hearing, perhaps for the first time, the sound of the future. Sputnik 1 launched on October 4th, 1957. That date has become one of the great turning points in modern history, but at the time, the satellite itself seemed almost unbelievably modest. It was not a giant space station. It was not carrying a crew. It was not packed with cameras or scientific instruments that would transform the public's understanding of Earth overnight. By later standards, Sputnik was very simple, and yet that simplicity is part of what makes the mission so remarkable. Because on that day, the goal was clear. Put an artificial object into orbit around the Earth. Keep it there. Let the world know it is there. If that could be done, then the boundary between Earth and space would be crossed forever. The satellite was launched by the Soviet Union from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, deep inside Soviet territory. To the world outside, much of the Soviet space effort remained secretive and hard to read. People knew that both superpowers were working toward a satellite launch, but there was still a sense that these plans belonged to the near future, to the next stage, to something still approaching. Then suddenly, it had happened. The launch vehicle lifted off and carried Sputnik into orbit. At that moment, humanity entered a new era, whether the world was fully prepared for it or not. Imagine the boldness of that moment. For all of human history, every object built by human hands had remained tied in some way to the Earth. Balloons could rise, airplanes could climb, artillery could arc through the sky, but everything came back down. Gravity always won. The sky was a ceiling. It might be penetrated briefly, but it could not yet be occupied. Sputnik changed that. For the first time, human beings had created something that would circle the Earth from above, falling forever around the planet rather than back down to its surface. That sounds familiar now because we live in a world filled with satellites, but in 1957 it was astonishing. The idea had become real. Sputnik itself was a polished metal sphere, a little under 2 feet across, with 4 long antennas trailing from its body. It weighed about 184 pounds. It was compact, clean, and strangely elegant. It looked like a machine from the future, as imagined by the 1950s. Smooth, bright, and purposeful. Inside, the satellite carried radio transmitters, batteries, and systems that allowed it to send signals back to Earth. Those signals were simple, but simplicity was enough. The mission did not need spectacle. It needed proof, and proof came in the form of sound. Beep, beep, beep. That steady transmission became one of the most famous sounds of the 20th century. It was not dramatic in the usual sense. It was not a roaring engine or a triumphant anthem. It was repetitive, mechanical, almost cold. But that was exactly why it had such power. It was real. It was unmistakable. It was coming from above. Anyone equipped to receive the signal could hear it. That mattered tremendously. This was not a claim hidden inside official statements or scientific papers. It was direct evidence. The satellite was there, orbiting over the Earth, announcing itself with every pass. And every beep carried a message far larger than the one encoded in radio waves. It said the Soviets had done it first. It said orbit was achievable. It said the planet was now part of a larger human frontier. Sputnik traveled around the Earth roughly once every hour and a half. Again and again, it passed overhead, circling the globe as people tracked it, listened for it, and tried to grasp what it meant. It turned the sky into something newly active. The heavens were no longer just a place of stars, planets, and imagination. Human technology had joined the cosmos. There is something almost poetic about that first satellite being so simple. If Sputnik had been a giant, highly advanced machine, people might have focused only on its complexity. But because it was small and stripped down, the deeper meaning stood out clearly. This mission was about first principles. Can we place something in orbit? Can we maintain that orbit? Can we send signals from space to Earth? The answer, delivered in that calm, repeating rhythm, was yes. The batteries on board Sputnik did not last very long. After only a few weeks, the transmission stopped. But by then, the world had already been transformed. The silence that followed did not diminish the achievement. In some ways, it amplified it. The beeping ended, but the consequences kept spreading. Sputnik itself remained in orbit for several months before eventually re-entering the atmosphere and burning up. That detail is important too. The first satellite did not stay in space forever. It was temporary. Fragile even. Yet its influence was anything but temporary. The spacecraft perished. The age it began did not. And when we talk about the mission, it is worth pausing on just how efficient it was in historical terms. Sputnik did not need years of service. It did not need groundbreaking imagery. It did not need a human on board to wave at the cameras. It needed one thing above all else: success. That success changed the psychological map of the world. Think about the chain reaction contained within this one mission. If a satellite could be launched, then more satellites could follow. If objects could orbit Earth, then scientific instruments could orbit Earth. If complex payloads could be orbited, then perhaps one day people could be orbited too. And if people could orbit Earth, then perhaps they could go farther. To the modern ear, that progression sounds obvious. In 1957, it felt like the opening of a door that had been sealed throughout all of history. That is why Sputnik's mission matters so much. It was not dramatic because of what it carried. It was dramatic because of what it proved. It proved that spaceflight had moved out of theory and into reality. It proved that orbit was no longer a mathematical dream or a speculative sketch in the margins of science fiction. It proved that the next chapter of human history would unfold, at least in part, above the atmosphere. And it did all of that with a mission so compact that it can almost be described in a sentence. Launch the satellite, reach orbit, transmit a signal, circle the Earth. That was enough. In fact, that was more than enough, because once Sputnik was up there, the whole world had to respond. Scientists responded, militaries responded, politicians responded, Teachers responded, children responded. The launch became larger than the machine itself almost immediately. The satellite was small, but the mission created an event so big that it changed national priorities and public imagination in a matter of days. There is also something worth appreciating in the emotional contrast at the heart of Sputnik. The satellite itself was quiet in every visual sense. It was a silver sphere in darkness, moving silently through space. Yet on Earth, its effect was loud. It set off headlines, debates, fear, fascination, and urgency. A small object in orbit created a massive disturbance on the ground. That is the essence of the mission. A simple machine, launched into an empty sky, became the first human-made moon. A brief radio signal became a global announcement. A single successful orbit became the beginning of the space age. And that is why Sputnik remains one of the most important missions ever flown. It did not take humans to another world. It did something even more foundational. It changed humanity's relationship with this one. Before Sputnik, space was above us. After Sputnik, we were in it.
If you want more of this, but in a quicker format, Orbital Briefing is also on TikTok. It's the same mission breakdowns, the same history, just condensed into short cinematic updates you can watch anytime. Just search Orbital Briefing on TikTok and you'll find it there.
In this part of the episode, we focus on Sputnik as an object. This is where we slow down and really look at the hardware itself. Because part of the genius of Sputnik is how simple it was. The machine that opened the space age was not huge, complicated looking, or visually overwhelming. It was compact, elegant, and direct. And that simplicity is a big part of why it became so iconic. When people picture the dawn of spaceflight, they often imagine something grand. Massive rockets, complex capsules, banks of controls, rows of blinking lights, great towers of machinery pushing against the limits of engineering. Sputnik, by contrast, was almost minimalist. It was a polished metal sphere, about 23 inches in diameter, small enough that, by modern standards, it feels almost modest. It weighed about 184 pounds, which is certainly substantial, but still surprisingly light for something that would become one of the most consequential machines in history. Its shape was simple and beautiful, a sphere, smooth, bright, reflective. 4 long antennas extended from one side, giving it a look that was both scientific and strangely artistic. It looked futuristic in the way only the 1950s could imagine the future. Clean lines, shiny surfaces, a machine that seemed to belong equally to engineering and symbolism. That appearance mattered. Sputnik did not just succeed technically, it succeeded visually. It looked like an object from the future, which made it easier for the public to accept that the future had truly arrived. Even people who knew nothing about orbital mechanics could look at Sputnik and understand that this was something new. It was unlike a car, unlike a ship, unlike an airplane. It belonged to a different category entirely. And yet, for all of its visual elegance, Sputnik was built around a very practical idea. The Soviets were not trying to create the most advanced orbital platform imaginable. They were trying to do something first, and to do it reliably. That shaped everything about the machine. Sputnik was designed to be functional, robust, and clear in purpose. It carried radio transmitters, a power source, and systems to monitor internal conditions. It was pressurized, sealed, and engineered to survive the trip into orbit and operate long enough to prove the mission had succeeded. It did not need elaborate instruments or ambitious experiments to make history. The achievement was the machine itself. That is one of the most important ideas to understand here. Today, we often judge spacecraft by what they do once they get to space. We think about telescopes taking images, probes studying distant planets, rovers collecting samples, or satellites powering modern communications. Sputnik comes from an earlier moment. For Sputnik, getting to orbit was the breakthrough. Remaining there while transmitting a signal was enough to transform the world. The machine's radio system is a perfect example of that philosophy. Sputnik transmitted on simple radio frequencies, sending out the famous beeping signal that people around the world would come to associate with the beginning of the space age. That beep was technically modest, but emotionally enormous. It turned the satellite into something you could hear. That made it immediate in a way that photographs or newspaper reports could never quite match. People did not just read about Sputnik, they listened to it. That distinction matters. Hearing the signal made the satellite feel real. It gave the machine a kind of presence. Each beep was proof that it was still up there, still circling, still alive in a mechanical sense. The signal cut through abstraction. A satellite was no longer a theoretical object described by scientists or politicians. It was something physically out there in the sky, announcing itself to anyone prepared to listen. There is something haunting about that, even today. A small sphere, moving through the darkness above Earth, sending out a simple electronic pulse as it passes overhead. No voice, no message in words, no explanation, just presence. That made Sputnik feel larger than it was. the machine also carried sensors that helped monitor its environment and internal condition. This gave Soviet scientists useful information, but again, the mission was kept lean and focused. Sputnik was not overloaded with goals. It was designed around the idea that success comes from clarity. Keep the payload manageable, keep the mission defined, make sure the object survives launch, reaches orbit, and transmits. That design logic helped make the mission achievable. It is easy to forget how risky all of this still was in 1957. Spaceflight was not routine. Orbital launches were not normal engineering events. Every system had to work in conditions that human beings were only beginning to understand in practical terms. The rocket had to lift the payload with enough speed and precision to place it into orbit. The satellite had to endure intense vibration, acceleration, temperature shifts, and the harsh environment of space. A failure at any point could have ended the mission or turned it into a historical footnote. Instead, the machine did exactly what it needed to do. That reliability is part of Sputnik's legacy too. Its success gave weight to Soviet engineering. It suggested discipline, competence, and confidence. It told the world that this was not a lucky stunt. It was the product of a real technical capability. And because the machine itself seemed so calm and simple, its success felt even more unsettling to outside observers. The less dramatic Sputnik looked, the more it suggested that the Soviet Union had crossed this threshold with assurance rather than desperation. The antennas are worth pausing on as well, because they are one of the most recognizable features of Sputnik's design. Long and angled, they gave the sphere its unmistakable silhouette. Without them, Sputnik might have looked like almost any shiny orb from mid-century science fiction. With them, it became distinct, instantly recognizable. The antennas served a technical purpose, of course, helping the satellite transmit its signal effectively, but they also helped define the visual identity of the space age's first machine. That visual identity became powerful very quickly. In posters, illustrations, newspaper graphics, and later historical retellings, Sputnik's shape became shorthand for the birth of spaceflight. A sphere with trailing antennas could instantly evoke the late 1950s, the Cold War, and the moment when orbit stopped being a dream and became a fact. Few spacecraft have ever had such a clean symbolic form, and perhaps that is because Sputnik emerged before spaceflight became crowded with competing images. There were no lunar modules yet, no shuttle orbiters, no sprawling space stations, no famous Mars rovers. Sputnik arrived first, and first impressions matter. It helped establish the visual language of the space age. It gave the future a shape. There is also a deeper lesson in the machine itself. Sputnik reminds us that revolutionary technology does not always look revolutionary by later standards. We live in an age of miniaturized electronics, advanced materials, autonomous systems, powerful sensors, and spacecraft that can navigate across the solar system. Compared to those machines, Sputnik appears primitive. But history does not measure importance by complexity alone. It measures moments by what they unlock. And Sputnik unlocked everything that followed. Without a machine like Sputnik, there is no rapid proof that orbit is possible. Without that proof, there is no immediate pressure for a response from the United States. Without that response, the early space race unfolds differently. Without that early race, the path to Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and the rest of the first space age looks very different. That is why the machine deserves this much attention. It is tempting to rush past it because it seems so simple. But simplicity was the point. Sputnik stripped the challenge down to its essentials and succeeded. That made the achievement impossible to dismiss. Nobody could say the idea of orbital flight was still too far away, too uncertain, or too theoretical. The machine had already answered the question. Yes, it could be done. Yes, it had been done. And yes, the world would have to live with the consequences. There is a certain purity in that first orbital machine. Sputnik was not yet part of a mature space industry. It was not the product of decades of accumulated orbital heritage. It belonged to the raw frontier phase, when every success redefined what people thought possible. That gives it a special place in history. Later spacecraft may be more advanced, more capable, and more sophisticated in every measurable way. But Sputnik has something they can never have. It was first. It was the first machine to circle the Earth. The first machine to turn orbit from theory into reality. The first machine to speak to humanity from space. And because it was first, every detail of it carries a kind of weight. The polished shell, the antennas, the radio tone, the compact body, the almost startling simplicity. All of it becomes part of the story. Even the fact that Sputnik was temporary adds to its power. Its batteries lasted only a short time. Its signal eventually stopped. Months later, it re-entered the atmosphere and burned up. In physical terms, the machine's life was brief, but in symbolic terms, it became immortal almost immediately. That polished sphere was up there for a short season, yet its image and meaning have endured for generations. It is one of history's great paradoxes. A machine built for a relatively brief mission ended up helping define an entire era, and that may be the best way to understand Sputnik as hardware. It was not large, it was not ornate, it was not built to do everything. It was built to do one thing that no machine had ever done before: reach orbit and announce its presence. That was enough to change the world. In this part of the episode, we shift away from the machine itself and focus on the human story, because history is never just about hardware. A satellite can be built, launched, and tracked with technical precision, but its true meaning comes from the people around it. The ones who dreamed it up, the ones who made it possible, and the millions who suddenly had to live in a world changed by it. Sputnik was a machine, but it hit the world as a human event. For the Soviet Union, the launch was a triumph of prestige. It was proof that Soviet science, Soviet engineering, and Soviet industry could accomplish something first on the grandest possible stage. This mattered enormously in the Cold War. The competition between the Soviet Union and the United States was never just about weapons or territory. It was about image. It was about momentum. It was about convincing the world that your system represented the future. And on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union looked like the future. That mattered to Soviet leadership. It mattered to the global audience watching the Cold War unfold. And it mattered to countries around the world that were deciding, in one way or another, which model of power, progress, and modernity seemed strongest. Behind that victory were engineers, scientists, technicians, and planners whose work had brought the mission to life. They had taken the abstract challenge of orbital flight and turned it into a working reality. Their names are important to the historical record, but what matters most in the flow of this story is the collective effort. Sputnik was not the work of one lone genius in a lab. It was the product of a state-driven push into rocketry and advanced engineering, carried forward by teams of people working under immense pressure and with enormous stakes attached to success. There must have been pride in that moment. Relief, too. Imagine the tension of watching something so ambitious rise into the sky, knowing that years of effort rested on what happened next. Then imagine realizing that it had worked. The payload was in orbit, the signal was coming through, history had just been made, and you were one of the people who helped make it happen. That is one side of the human story. The other side was unfolding almost immediately across the United States. In America, Sputnik produced a reaction that went far beyond curiosity. There was fascination, certainly, wonder too. But above all, there was anxiety. That anxiety is essential to understanding the people part of this story. Americans did not hear Sputnik's beeping signal as a charming technological novelty. Many heard it as a warning. The Cold War had already conditioned the public to think in terms of rivalry, threat, and national vulnerability. So when the Soviet Union placed a satellite into orbit, the obvious question followed almost instantly. If they can launch a satellite over our heads, what else can they launch? That question landed in homes, in classrooms, in newsrooms, and in government offices. Ordinary people felt it. Parents felt it. Students felt it. Scientists felt it. Military officials felt it. Politicians definitely felt it. And because the satellite physically passed over the Earth, the psychological effect was unusually intense. This was not some distant event happening on the other side of the globe. It was overhead. It was in the sky. It was above everyone. That gave the Soviet achievement an unsettling intimacy. Americans were used to thinking of their country as technologically dominant, or at least securely competitive. Sputnik challenged that assumption in a very public and very visible way. Newspapers seized on the drama. Broadcasters amplified it. Public debate followed quickly. Was the United States falling behind? Had America become complacent? Were Soviet rockets now superior? Was the country prepared for what came next? These were not fringe questions. They were national questions. And in that sense, Sputnik did something extraordinary. It turned science and engineering into matters of mass public emotion. It brought orbital mechanics into everyday conversation. It made rocket development something ordinary families discussed at the dinner table. The people changed because the event forced them to. Children were part of this story too, and their role matters more than it might seem at first. Across the United States, young people grew up in the shadow of Sputnik. For some, it inspired fear. For others, it inspired ambition. A child hearing about satellites in 1957 might later become an engineer, a physicist, a pilot, or an astronaut. The event changed policy, but it also changed imagination. It made space feel urgent, real, and suddenly relevant to a generation that would go on to build the next chapters of the space age. Teachers felt the impact as well. Education became part of the response. Science and math were no longer just academic subjects in a general sense. They became tied to national competitiveness, to security, and to the future. Sputnik helped drive a broader cultural shift in how technical education was valued. It helped create the feeling that falling behind in science was not just an educational problem, it was a national problem. Scientists in the United States had a complicated reaction too. Many were impressed by the achievement, because from a technical standpoint, it was undeniably impressive. But admiration was mixed with frustration, urgency, and concern. They understood exactly what Sputnik represented. This was not a symbolic stunt, it was a demonstration of real capability. And scientists understood better than most people that the technical threshold the Soviet Union had crossed was a serious one. Military planners saw the same thing from an even darker angle. Rockets capable of reaching orbit share essential routes with rockets capable of delivering weapons across vast distances. That overlap made Sputnik far more than a peaceful or scientific story in the minds of defense officials. The launch suggested that Soviet missile technology might be further along than many Americans had hoped. Politicians, meanwhile, were trapped in a different kind of pressure. They had to answer public fear, project confidence, and push for a response, all while processing the reality that a major strategic and symbolic milestone had gone to the other side. That is why Sputnik quickly became larger than an engineering story. It became a political story, a cultural story, and a story about national identity. Who are we if we are not first? That question sat quietly behind much of the American reaction. It is also worth remembering that the people's story was not uniform. Some Americans were deeply alarmed. Others were intrigued and energized. Some saw danger first. Others saw possibility. That range of reactions is part of what makes Sputnik such a rich historical moment. It was not experienced in one emotion only. It produced fear, embarrassment, curiosity, ambition, and wonder, sometimes all at once. And then there is the broader human story beyond the two superpowers. Around the world, other nations watched this unfold and drew their own conclusions. Sputnik signaled that humanity had entered a new era, whether nations were active participants in the Cold War or not. The launch suggested that space would become part of international prestige, global science, military strategy, and technological development. People in many countries saw that the world had changed, even if they were not the ones driving the initial race. That wider human dimension matters because Sputnik was bigger than a contest between Washington and Moscow. It represented something planetary. Human beings had built something that left the Earth and stayed there. Even in the middle of political tension, that remained a staggering thought. There is also a quieter emotional layer to the people's story that deserves attention. For generations, human beings had imagined the heavens as distant and unreachable. They told stories about the stars, studied the planets, mapped constellations, and dreamed about flight beyond the atmosphere. Then, suddenly, a machine made by human hands was moving through that realm. That changes something in people even if they cannot fully articulate it in the moment. Sputnik frightened people, yes, but it also expanded them. It forced them to think bigger. It forced them to consider that the old boundaries were gone. And that is part of why the launch landed so deeply. It was a geopolitical event, but it was also a civilizational one. It changed what people believed was possible in their own lifetime. The Soviet engineers and officials who celebrated the launch were feeling triumph. American citizens listening nervously to the news were feeling unease. Children looking up at the sky may have felt curiosity. Scientists felt urgency. Leaders felt pressure. And taken together, all of those reactions became the true human payload of Sputnik. The machine went into orbit. The emotions stayed on Earth. And those emotions mattered because they shaped everything that followed. They helped drive the American response. They influenced public spending, education, policy, and research. They transformed space from a niche dream into a major arena of human effort. The satellite itself was small, but the human reaction around it was vast. That is the story of the people. A launch team in the Soviet Union proved it could be done. A rival superpower was forced to confront what that meant. A generation of citizens, students, scientists, and leaders began to see space differently. And the world, in all its anxiety and wonder, began adjusting to a new reality. Humanity had reached the sky.
If you're enjoying this episode, this is exactly what the American spaceplane was built for. It's a full-length book that dives deeper into the space shuttle program, the engineering decisions, the risks, and the moments that defined it. If you want the deeper version of everything we talk about here, you can find the American spaceplane at retrojetstudios.com.
In this part of the episode, we look at what happened after Sputnik reached orbit, because the launch itself was only the beginning. The real impact came in the hours, days, weeks, and months that followed. This is where a small satellite became a global event. This is where a successful mission turned into a crisis of confidence, a political earthquake, and the spark that accelerated the space race. Sputnik went up as a machine. It came down, in a sense, as a shockwave. The most immediate effect was psychological. That is important because psychological events can be harder to measure than military or scientific ones, but they are often just as powerful. Sputnik did not strike a city. It did not destroy infrastructure. It did not carry a weapon. Yet it rattled the United States and much of the world because it changed how people understood power. Before Sputnik, many Americans assumed that the United States was leading the way into the technological future, or at the very least standing on equal footing with the Soviet Union in the most important fields. The launch disrupted that confidence almost overnight. Suddenly, the Soviet Union was not just a rival with political ambitions and military strength, it was the nation that had done something first in one of the most dramatic and forward-looking arenas imaginable. That hit hard. It hit hard because space felt like the future, and if the Soviets had reached the future first, what did that say about the balance of power in the present? The public reaction in the United States reflected that anxiety almost immediately. News reports treated the launch as a major national event. People who had never given much thought to orbital mechanics or rocket development were suddenly paying close attention. The beeping signal from Sputnik became more than a technical detail. It became a symbol of American vulnerability and Soviet momentum. You can almost feel the mood of the country shifting in real time. There was astonishment, certainly. There was fascination, too. But under it all was a new unease. For many Americans, Sputnik made the Cold War feel more intimate, more immediate, more overhead, literally. That mattered. A rival nation had placed an object above the Earth, above the United States, above everyone, and there was a profound psychological difference between hearing about Soviet military strength in general terms and knowing that a Soviet-made object was physically passing through the sky above you. That image stayed with people. The satellite was small, but the symbolism was enormous. It suggested reach, it suggested capability. It suggested that geography offered less protection than many had hoped. Oceans looked smaller in a world where rockets could place objects in orbit. And from there, the fear expanded. Because once people understood that satellites and rockets were connected, many drew the most unsettling conclusion available. If the Soviet Union could launch a satellite into orbit, then perhaps it could also launch weapons across continents. The same engineering principles that made orbital flight possible also pointed toward intercontinental ballistic missiles. That made Sputnik feel like more than a scientific breakthrough. It felt like a demonstration of strategic power. Whether every fear was fully justified in that moment almost mattered less than the fact that the fears were real. People believed them, leaders responded to them, policies were shaped by them. That is what made the shockwave so powerful. It did not need to be perfectly rational in every detail to reshape the world. The pressure in Washington built quickly. Political leaders could not treat Sputnik as a passing curiosity. The launch demanded a response, both practical and symbolic. The United States had to show that it could compete, that it could answer the Soviet achievement, and that it was not permanently behind. That urgency poured into public conversation. Were American schools doing enough to prepare scientists and engineers? Was the government investing enough in advanced research? Had the military focused on the right priorities? Was the nation taking the Soviet threat seriously enough? These questions were suddenly everywhere, and once they entered the conversation, they did not disappear. Sputnik helped transform science, engineering, and education into matters of national strategy. Math and physics were no longer just subjects for specialists or students with academic interests. They became part of the larger story of survival, competition, and prestige. A nation that fell behind in technical expertise now risked falling behind in the future itself. That change in public thinking is one of Sputnik's most important consequences. It helped create a culture in which science mattered differently. It gave urgency to technical education. It pushed governments to think of research as central to national power. It made space a front line. The American response, however, was not smooth. In fact, one of the most painful moments in the shockwave came when the United States attempted to answer Sputnik and failed in full public view. The Vanguard program, which had been selected to launch an American satellite, suffered a humiliating setback when a rocket rose briefly from the pad and then exploded in a highly visible failure. For a country already shaken by Sputnik, that moment felt like salt in the wound. It seemed to confirm the worst fears of critics and the gloomiest interpretations of the Soviet lead. Embarrassment now joined anxiety. The contrast could not have been more painful. The Soviets had launched the first satellite successfully. The American attempt had failed in a fireball with cameras rolling. That image stuck too, and it increased the demand for action. But if Sputnik exposed weakness, it also generated momentum. That is another part of the shockwave. Fear can paralyze, but it can also mobilize. In the United States, Sputnik became the kind of event that forced a reassessment at every level. Government agencies moved with greater urgency. Scientists and engineers received greater attention. Public support for space and technology efforts grew stronger. The country was embarrassed, yes. it was also activated. That activation helped lead to the successful launch of Explorer 1 in January 1958, which became the first American satellite. Explorer 1 was an important reply, both technically and psychologically. It showed that the United States was in the game. It demonstrated that America could reach orbit too. It did not erase the fact that the Soviets had been first, but it began to stabilize the American position and shift the narrative from shock to competition. That shift is crucial. Sputnik did not simply frighten the United States, it compelled the United States to accelerate, and acceleration changes history. Within a surprisingly short span of time, the effects of Sputnik were visible in institutions, budgets, rhetoric, and priorities. The United States began reorganizing and intensifying its approach to space and science. The event helped build momentum for the creation of NASA in 1958, a move that gave the country a civilian agency dedicated to space exploration and development. It also strengthened the sense that space was not some side project or speculative curiosity. It was central to national identity, global competition, and the future of technology. That may be the deepest part of the shockwave. Sputnik changed the scale of ambition. Before the launch, spaceflight could still be discussed as a frontier of the future, exciting but distant. After the launch, it became a frontier of the present. Governments no longer had the luxury of treating it as optional. If one superpower was already in orbit, the other had to follow, and quickly. The world beyond the United States felt the impact too. Allies, rivals, and non-aligned nations all watched carefully. Sputnik changed perceptions of Soviet strength, perhaps especially in places where image and momentum mattered politically. The launch allowed the Soviet Union to present itself as a leader in science and technology, which had implications far beyond space. It shaped global prestige. It influenced political narratives. It gave the Soviet system a visible, dramatic victory in the contest for international opinion. That is why the shockwave spread so far. This was not just a domestic American crisis. It was a worldwide statement. The future had become a competitive arena, and the Soviet Union had scored the opening point. There was also a more philosophical kind of shock buried inside all of this. Beneath the fear, the headlines, and the rivalry, Sputnik forced humanity to recognize something fundamental. Earth was no longer the full boundary of human-made activity. A machine from our world was circling the planet from above. Human civilization had extended itself into space. That realization carried awe even for those who first met it with dread. You can imagine people standing outside, looking up into the dark, trying to spot the satellite as it passed overhead. In those moments, Cold War anxiety and human wonder must have collided. Yes, this was a Soviet achievement. Yes, it raised frightening questions. But it was also a human first. Something built on Earth had entered the heavens and stayed there. That is not a small thing. It changes how a species sees itself. And perhaps that is why the shockwave was so enduring. It was strategic, political, educational, cultural, emotional, and almost existential all at once. Different people felt different parts of it more strongly, but very few could ignore it. Some heard danger, some heard possibility, many heard both. The beeping of Sputnik eventually stopped. Its batteries died, its signal faded. The satellite itself would not last forever. But the shockwave did not depend on the continued life of the machine. Once the threshold had been crossed, it could not be uncrossed. The world now knew that orbit was achievable. That knowledge alone was enough to launch a new era. And that is the heart of this section. Sputnik did not merely succeed in space. It destabilized assumptions on Earth. It unsettled a superpower. It energized another. It forced governments to act. It pushed science to the center of public life. It accelerated the race that would define the next chapter of the 20th century. A small polished sphere had gone into orbit. A giant wave of consequence had followed it. That was the shockwave of Sputnik. And the world would spend the next decade living inside it. In this part of the episode, we step back from the launch itself and look at the bigger meaning of Sputnik. This is where the story moves from event to legacy, because Sputnik was more than the first satellite. It was the moment that changed humanity's relationship with space, reshaped the Cold War, and set in motion a chain of events that still defines the modern world. It is easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to reduce Sputnik to a first. The first artificial satellite, the first object placed into orbit, the first machine to announce itself from space. All of that is true, but those facts by themselves still do not fully explain why Sputnik matters. What made Sputnik so important was not simply that it happened first. What made it matter was what it unlocked. Before Sputnik, space was mostly theoretical in practical terms. Scientists understood orbital mechanics. Engineers could sketch the path forward. Visionaries imagined stations, moon flights, and journeys to other worlds. But those ideas still lived in the realm of possibility. They had not yet crossed into lived reality. Sputnik changed that in one night. After October 4th, 1957, no one could honestly say that orbit was some distant dream for the far future. The proof was moving overhead. The argument was over. Humanity had entered the space age whether governments were ready or not. That shift from theory to reality is one of the most important transitions in modern history, because once something becomes real, it begins to reorganize the world around it. That is exactly what Sputnik did. It changed government priorities. It changed public imagination. It changed military thinking. It changed education. It changed science. It changed the pace of history. That is a remarkable legacy for a machine so small and so simple. One reason Sputnik matters so much is that it forced powerful nations to take space seriously at once. Before the launch, spaceflight could still be treated as a fascinating but somewhat distant field, something promising, something worth exploring, but not necessarily the center of national urgency. After the launch, that was no longer possible. Space had become immediate, it had become strategic, it had become part of the contest for global leadership. In that sense, Sputnik did not just begin the space age, it accelerated it. It turned what might have unfolded gradually into something urgent and competitive. And when urgency meets competition, progress can speed up dramatically. That is one of the great paradoxes of the early space age. It was born from rivalry, fear, and the pressure of the Cold War. Yet out of that tension came extraordinary leaps in science, engineering, and exploration. The chain from Sputnik leads directly into the great milestones that followed. Explorer 1, NASA, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, human spaceflight, lunar landings, space stations, planetary probes. The idea that human beings could become a spacefaring species did not begin in full with Sputnik, but it became unavoidable because of Sputnik. The launch set the tempo. Everyone else had to respond to it. And because nations responded, the future arrived faster. Sputnik also matters because it changed the way people saw the Earth. That may sound strange, since the satellite itself did not send back photographs like later spacecraft would. But the act of orbiting Earth carried a powerful conceptual shift. For the first time, a human-made object was circling the planet from above. Even without dramatic imagery, that reality encouraged a new perspective. Earth could be viewed as a whole. It could be studied from space. It could be monitored, measured, and understood in ways that had never before been possible. That idea would eventually lead to weather satellites, communication satellites, navigation satellites, Earth observation, climate science, reconnaissance systems, and much more. Modern life is saturated with the descendants of Sputnik. We live in a civilization that depends on space infrastructure so deeply that most people barely think about it. Phones, maps, shipping, banking, military operations, television, weather forecasting, internet backbones, emergency response, and global communications all exist in a world shaped by orbital technology. Sputnik did not do all of that itself, but it opened the door. That is why it matters beyond the Cold War. Its legacy is not confined to one rivalry or one decade. It reaches directly into daily life now. There is also the matter of symbolism, and symbolism is never trivial in history. Sputnik became a symbol of entry into a new frontier. Human beings had sailed oceans, crossed continents, flown through the atmosphere, and split the atom. Now they had extended their presence into space. That is a civilizational threshold. It marks a species doing something fundamentally new. Even if the first step was small, it still changed the path ahead. And that first step was important precisely because it was small. There is a lesson in that. History does not always begin with the most spectacular achievement. Sometimes it begins with the first undeniable proof that a thing can be done. Sputnik was not the most advanced spacecraft ever built. It was not even the most scientifically productive spacecraft of its own era for very long. But it did something even more powerful. It made the next step impossible to ignore. Once Sputnik flew, human spaceflight felt less like fantasy. Once Sputnik flew, lunar missions felt more imaginable. Once Sputnik flew, the long arc toward permanent activity in space truly began. It changed the scale of what people could believe. That matters because belief shapes investment, policy, careers, and ambition. A child inspired by Sputnik might choose science. A politician alarmed by Sputnik might support research funding. An engineer motivated by Sputnik might help build the rockets and spacecraft of the next generation. A nation embarrassed by Sputnik might reorganize its institutions to make sure it never falls behind again. That is another reason this launch matters so much. Its consequences were not confined to the mission. They multiplied through human decisions. They spread through culture. They entered classrooms and laboratories and budget hearings and military briefings. They became part of how the 20th century unfolded. And there is a deeper emotional truth at the heart of all of this. Sputnik forced humanity to confront the fact that the sky was no longer beyond reach. For thousands of years, the heavens had been a place of myth, observation, religion, poetry, navigation, and scientific curiosity. People charted stars and dreamed of reaching them, but the sky remained, in practical terms, a barrier. Then, in 1957, that barrier cracked. A machine built on Earth crossed into that realm and stayed there. That changes the imagination of a species. After Sputnik, the question was no longer whether humanity could reach space. The question became what would happen next. Who would go first? How far could we go? What would we build there? Could people live there? Could we reach the moon? Could we go to Mars? Those questions gained new force because Sputnik had turned the opening sentence of the story into fact. And of course, Sputnik matters because it set the Cold War on a new and even more dramatic course. The space race became one of the most visible and emotionally powerful chapters of the broader US-Soviet rivalry. Space offered something unique. It was a technological contest that the whole world could watch. Rockets rose, satellites beeped, capsules splashed down, cosmonauts and astronauts became heroes. The competition moved from secret laboratories into public imagination. That visibility mattered enormously. It turned space exploration into political theater, national identity, and global prestige all at once. Without Sputnik, that phase of the Cold War does not unfold in the same way. Without Sputnik, the race to the moon may not happen in the same form or on the same timeline. Without Sputnik, NASA may still emerge eventually, but under different circumstances and with a different sense of urgency. That is why Sputnik sits so close to the root of modern space history. It was the ignition point. It did not contain everything that followed, but it set the chain reaction in motion. There is another reason Sputnik matters, and it may be the most human of all. It gave people a new frontier while they were living through fear. The 1950s were defined by nuclear anxiety, ideological division, and a sense that technological progress could just as easily destroy the world as improve it. Sputnik carried some of that fear with it. It made people worry about missiles, vulnerability, and falling behind. But it also pointed upward. It suggested that technology could do something other than threaten. It could extend knowledge. It could expand human reach. It could open a future that was larger than the conflicts of the moment. That does not erase the tension of the Cold War, but it does complicate it in a way that feels very human. The same event that frightened millions also inspired millions. The same satellite that triggered panic also sparked dreams. That duality is part of why Sputnik remains such a powerful symbol. It captures both the anxiety and the possibility of the modern technological age. And maybe that is the clearest way to understand why it matters. Sputnik was not just the start of a race. It was the beginning of a new condition for humanity, a world with things above us that we put there. A world where orbit became usable. A world where orbit became usable. A world where space became part of politics, science, defense, economics, and everyday life. A world where leaving Earth was no longer a fantasy reserved for fiction. That is the world we still live in. Every satellite overhead, every crewed mission, every Mars rover, every lunar plan, every weather image from orbit, every GPS route on a phone, every live broadcast carried through space, all of it exists in the long shadow of that first little sphere. Sputnik's beeping signal lasted only a short time. Its meaning never really stopped. That is why it matters. Because the machine was temporary, but the threshold it crossed was permanent. Because the mission was brief, but the era it opened is still unfolding. Because the first step into orbit turned out to be one of the most important steps our species has ever taken. And because once that signal came down from the sky in October of 1957, history could not go back to the way it had been before.
If you want to bring some of this history into your everyday life, Retrojet Studios was built around exactly that idea. Everything there is inspired by real missions, real hardware, and the era of spaceflight that made all of this possible. From posters to collectibles, it's designed for people who genuinely love this stuff. You can check it out at retrojetstudios.com.
In this final part of the episode, we bring everything together. This is where we step back from the details of the launch, the machine, and the political shock, and reflect on what Sputnik really meant. Because for all the fear it sparked and all the urgency it created, Sputnik's deepest legacy is larger than the Cold War. It changed how humanity saw itself. When Sputnik crossed the sky in October of 1957, it did more than begin a competition. It changed the human horizon. That may sound dramatic, but it is hard to overstate how profound that shift really was. For all of human history, the sky had been something we looked at, studied, admired, feared, worshipped, and imagined. It was the realm of stars, planets, weather, gods, stories, and dreams. Human beings had climbed mountains, crossed oceans, and flown through the air, but space still belonged to the unreachable. Then Sputnik happened. And suddenly, space was no longer unreachable. That alone would have made it historic. But Sputnik mattered in another way too. It did not arrive in a calm or neutral world. It arrived in the middle of a superpower rivalry, in a time shaped by suspicion, nuclear anxiety, and the constant pressure to prove national strength. That meant the first satellite was never going to be received as a simple scientific milestone. It came with fear attached to it. It came with pride attached to it. It came with questions that went far beyond engineering. Who was ahead? Who was vulnerable? Who would control the future? Those questions gave Sputnik its immediate power. But over time, something larger emerged. The satellite that began as a Cold War shock became, in hindsight, the opening note of a much broader human story. Because once the first object reached orbit, the rest of the space age became possible. Not inevitable, perhaps. History is never that neat, but possible in a new and undeniable way. From Sputnik, the line runs outward through the first American satellites, through the creation of NASA, through Yuri Gagarin and John Glenn, through Gemini and Apollo, through moonwalkers and space stations, through planetary probes and reusable spacecraft, through Hubble, the ISS, Mars rovers, and today's return to the moon. The details change, the machines become more advanced, the politics shift, the ambitions rise and fall and rise again, but the threshold remains the same. First, something had to go up and stay there. Sputnik did that, and once it did, the door was open. There is something else worth sitting with here. Sputnik was not grand in the way we often think of historic achievements. It did not carry astronauts. It did not beam back stunning photographs. It did not land on another world. It did not even operate for very long. Its signal faded. Its batteries died. It eventually fell back to Earth and burned up, and yet its importance only grew. That is one of the great lessons of space history. Sometimes the biggest turning points begin with the smallest and simplest machines, a polished sphere, a radio tone, a single successful orbit. That was enough to shift the course of nations and expand the imagination of a species. And maybe that is why Sputnik still feels powerful, even now, because beneath all the Cold War context and the familiar historical milestones, there is something deeply human about it. People looked up and realized that one of their own creations was moving through the sky. Something built on Earth had escaped Earth. That changes the way you think about limits. It changes the way you think about the future. It changes what seems possible in your own lifetime. For some people, Sputnik felt like danger. For others, it felt like promise. For many, it was both at once. That combination still defines so much of spaceflight today. Space is wonder, but it is also competition. It is science, but it is also strategy. It is exploration, but it is also politics. Sputnik introduced all of that in one moment. It carried the tension and possibility of the entire space age in miniature. And maybe that is the clearest way to think about it. Sputnik was small, but it made the world larger. It made the future feel closer. It forced humanity to think beyond the atmosphere, beyond borders, and beyond the old assumptions about what was possible. That is why its story still matters, because we are still living inside the age it began. Every time a rocket rises from a launch pad, every time a satellite slides into orbit, every time astronauts circle the Earth, every time we talk about moon bases, Mars missions, or the future of humanity beyond this planet, we are continuing a story that changed course in October of 1957. A story that began with a beep in the dark. And there is something fitting about that. No grand speech, no triumphant parade, no giant footprint in lunar dust, just a signal from overhead telling the world that the future had arrived. Sputnik did not end the old world in a single night, but it did begin the new one. And once that happened, there was no going back. This has been Orbital Briefing. I'm Ron Walker, and this week we went back to the moment it all began, when a small silver sphere rose into orbit and changed history forever. Sputnik was the first, but more importantly, it was the beginning. And from that moment on, space was no longer just above us. It was part of our story. Next week, we move from the beginning of the space age to the people and systems that make modern spaceflight possible. We're heading inside mission control to look at how NASA flies spacecraft from Earth, how engineers and flight controllers guide missions in real time, and why some of the most important work in space happens far from the launch pad. Until next time, keep looking up.
Thanks for listening to Orbital Briefing. This show is hosted by Ron Walker and is a production of Retrojet Studios. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to follow the show, leave a review, and share it with a fellow space enthusiast. To follow all things space, visit retrojetstudios.com. Until next time, keep looking up.